The blood on Marcus Lawson's hands had long since dried by the time he saw her kneeling in the meadow just outside Winslow, Arizona territory. But it still felt wet in his mind as he guided his horse along the dusty trail that spring morning of 1883. He had ridden 3 days straight from Tombstone, trying to outrun the memory of what he had witnessed in that saloon. The senseless shooting of an innocent bystander caught between two feuding ranchers. Marcus had been hired to protect one of them, but when the bullets started flying and a young woman serving drinks fell to the floor, bleeding out before anyone could help her, something inside him had broken clean through. He had walked away from the job, from the money, from everything he thought he knew about surviving in this harsh territory. Now he was just drifting, trying to find something pure in a world that seemed determined to stay dirty. The sight of her stopped him cold. She was bent low among the wildflowers that carpeted the meadow in brilliant splashes of orange, purple, and gold. Her dark blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light like spun honey. She wore a simple calico dress the color of cream, already dusty at the hem, and her hands moved with careful precision as she gathered stems of Indian paintbrush and lupine into a woven basket beside her. Marcus had seen plenty of women in his 26 years, but something about this moment, about her complete absorption in such a simple, innocent task, made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. It was as if she existed in a different world entirely, one where beauty still mattered and gentleness had not yet been beaten out of everything. He dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her, but his boots on the rocky ground made enough noise that she looked up. Her eyes were the color of spring leaves, bright green with flecks of gold, and they widened slightly at the sight of him standing there, dusty and trail-worn, with 3 days of beard stubble darkening his jaw. "Morning, miss," he said, pulling off his hat in a gesture his mother had taught him long before she died. "Did not mean to disturb you." She straightened slowly, the basket clutched in both hands like a shield, but her expression held more curiosity than fear. "You are not disturbing anything," she said, and her voice was softer than he expected, with a cultured Eastern accent that seemed out of place in this raw territory. "I was just collecting flowers for my aunt's boarding house. She likes to have fresh ones on the dining tables." "That is real nice of you," Marcus said, feeling awkward suddenly, aware of how rough he must look, how out of place in this peaceful scene. He glanced down at the flowers surrounding them, thousands of blooms swaying in the gentle breeze, and spotted a perfect specimen of desert marigold growing just a few feet away. Without thinking too hard about what he was doing or why, he walked over and plucked it carefully, keeping the stem long. Katherine Colter watched the cowboy approach with the flower in his hand, and her heart beat a little faster despite her best intentions to remain calm. She had been in Arizona territory for only 3 months, sent west by her father after her mother's death to stay with her Aunt Margaret and recover from her grief. But grief was not something you recovered from like influenza or a broken bone. It lived in you, became part of you, changed the very shape of your days. Still, there was something about the way this stranger moved, something gentle beneath the obvious roughness, that made her stand still instead of backing away as he came close. He was tall, she realized, perhaps 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard build of a man who spent his life outdoors. His eyes were gray like storm clouds, but kind somehow, with lines at the corners that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though he was not smiling now. "May I?" he asked, holding up the bright yellow flower, and Katherine found herself nodding before she fully understood what he intended. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted, and then with surprising gentleness for hands that looked so rough and capable. He tucked the desert marigold into her hair just above her left ear. His fingers brushed against her temple, and the touch sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "There," he said, stepping back to look at his work. "Prettiest thing I have seen in days." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "That is very forward of you, Mr. Lawson, Marcus Lawson." He twisted his hat in his hands, looking almost boyish despite the hard lines life had already carved into his face. "And you are right. I apologize for the forwardness. I have been on the trail too long, I think. Forgot my manners." "Katherine Colter," she said, surprising herself by extending her hand rather than accepting his apology and walking away as propriety suggested she should. "And I did not say I minded, only that it was forward." His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused, and he shook it with careful restraint as if afraid of his own strength. "You are new to Winslow," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I would remember seeing you before." 3 months now, Katherine confirmed, slipping her hand free though part of her wanted to hold on longer. "My aunt runs the Copper Bell boarding house on Main Street. I am staying with her for a while, helping with the cooking and cleaning and such." "The Copper Bell," Marcus repeated, nodding slowly. "I know it. Good reputation. Your aunt is Margaret Thornton." "Yes, do you know her?" "Met her once or twice. She has a kind word for everyone, even rough cowboys like me." He glanced back at his horse, which was cropping at the sparse grass along the trail, then returned his attention to Katherine. "I should let you get back to your flower picking. Your aunt will be wondering where you got to." "Probably," Katherine agreed, but she made no move to resume her task. Instead, she found herself asking, "Are you staying in Winslow, Mr. Lawson?" "Marcus, please. And I was not planning on it. Just passing through, really. Thought I might head north, maybe try Colorado or Wyoming, see if there is anything up that way that feels like home." There was something in his voice, a weariness that went bone deep, that made Katherine want to ask what he was running from. But they were strangers, and she had no right to his secrets. "Well, if you change your mind about passing through, the Copper Bell serves the best meals in town. Breakfast especially." "I will keep that in mind," Marcus said, settling his hat back on his head. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Katherine. A real pleasure." He mounted his horse with easy grace and touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then guided the animal back toward the main road. Katherine stood among the wildflowers, one hand unconsciously touching the marigold he had placed in her hair, and watched until he disappeared around the bend. Only then did she realize she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since her mother had died. By the time Katherine returned to the Copper Bell with her basket full of flowers, the morning was in full swing. Her aunt was in the kitchen, pulling fresh bread from the oven, and the smell made Katherine's stomach rumble despite the strange flutter of nerves that had taken up residence there. "You were gone a long time," Aunt Margaret said without turning around. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "I was starting to think a coyote had gotten you." "Just enjoying the morning," Katherine said, setting her basket on the work table and beginning to sort the flowers into smaller bunches. "It is so beautiful here, Aunt Margaret. The colors are incredible." "You have got a flower in your hair," her aunt observed, finally turning to look at her with raised eyebrows. "Did you put it there yourself?" Katherine's hand flew to the marigold and she felt her cheeks warm again. No. There was a cowboy on the trail. He picked it and put it there." "It was harmless, truly." "A cowboy." Aunt Margaret set down her oven mitts and crossed her arms, but her expression was more amused than concerned. "And did this cowboy have a name?" "Marcus Lawson. He said he knew you, or at least knew of you." Something shifted in her aunt's expression, a flicker of recognition followed by something that might have been concern. Marcus Lawson, tall fellow, gray eyes, looks like he has seen too much for his age. Yes, that sounds like him. Do you know him well? I know of him, Aunt Margaret said carefully. He has a reputation as a good man in a hard profession, protection work mostly, keeping ranchers and miners safe from bandits and claim jumpers. But I heard he walked away from a job in Tombstone recently. Some kind of trouble, though the details are fuzzy. She paused, studying Catherine's face. He is not the settling down kind, Katherine. I hope you are not getting any ideas. I only just met him, Katherine protested, pulling the flower from her hair and adding it to one of the bouquets with hands that trembled slightly. He said he was just passing through anyway. I doubt I will ever see him again. But even as she said it, she found herself hoping it was not true. Marcus had every intention of riding straight through Winslow and continuing north, as he had told Katherine. He made it as far as the edge of town before his horse threw a shoe, and by the time he found the blacksmith and got the animal properly shod, it was past noon, and his stomach was reminding him that he had not eaten since the previous evening. The Copper Bell boarding house stood on the corner of Main and 2nd Street, a 2-story building of whitewashed adobe with a wide front porch and blue-painted shutters. Through the windows, Marcus could see several tables occupied by diners, mostly men who looked like miners or ranch hands, all focused intently on their plates. He told himself he was only going in for the food, that the possibility of seeing Katherine again had nothing to do with his decision. He almost believed it until he pushed through the door, and his eyes immediately scanned the room looking for dark blonde hair and spring green eyes. She was not in the dining room, but an older version of her, presumably Aunt Margaret, approached with a knowing smile. "Mr. Lawson. My niece said you might stop by. Did she now?" Marcus felt his ears heat up like he was 16 again instead of 26. "I was just needing some food before I head out." "Of course. Take any open seat. We have got beef stew today, fresh bread, and apple pie if you have got room for dessert." Margaret Thornton's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. "Katherine made the pie herself. She has got a gift for baking." Marcus found himself grinning despite his best efforts to play it cool. "Then I reckon I will have to try it." He sat at a corner table where he could see both the front door and the kitchen entrance, a habit born of too many close calls and too many enemies made over the years. The stew arrived quickly, brought by a young Mexican girl who could not have been more than 15, and it was as good as anything he had tasted, rich and savory with chunks of tender beef and vegetables. He was halfway through his bowl when Katherine emerged from the kitchen carrying a coffee pot. She wore an apron over her calico dress now, and her hair was pinned up in a more practical style. But the marigold was tucked into the twist of blonde locks, and the sight made Marcus's chest tight again. She spotted him immediately, and a smile spread across her face that was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "Mr. Lawson, you changed your mind about passing through." "My horse had other ideas," Marcus said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "And I heard something about apple pie that cannot be missed." Katherine glanced back toward the kitchen, then made a decision and sat down, setting the coffee pot on the table between them. "I should not be sitting with customers, but the lunch rush is over and Aunt Margaret is in a generous mood today." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "She warned me about you, you know, said you were not the settling type." "Your aunt is a wise woman," Marcus said, meeting her eyes directly. "I have been moving from place to place for 8 years now, ever since my parents died. Never stayed anywhere longer than a few months, never had reason to." "What happened in Tombstone?" Katherine asked and then immediately looked apologetic. "I am sorry. That is none of my business. I should not have asked." But Marcus found himself wanting to tell her, wanting to unburden himself to this woman he had only just met. "A girl died," he said quietly. "Not much older than you, I would guess. She was caught in the crossfire of a gunfight I was supposed to prevent. I was hired to protect one of the men involved, but I was too slow, too focused on my employer, and she just died. Right there on the saloon floor, bleeding out while everyone stood around like it was just another Saturday night in Tombstone." Katherine's hand covered his on the table, warm and steady. "That was not your fault. Maybe not. But it was close enough that I could not stay in that line of work anymore. Could not keep pretending that protecting rich men's interests was worth the cost." He turned his hand over, palm up, and she let her fingers rest against his, neither holding nor pulling away. "I have been trying to figure out what comes next, where I go from here." "Maybe you are looking too far ahead," Katherine said softly. "Maybe the next step is just staying for Pi." He laughed, really laughed, and it felt like the first genuine moment of joy he had experienced in weeks. "All right then, I will stay for Pi." The pie was excellent, flaky crust and perfectly spiced apples that melted on his tongue. But Marcus barely tasted it because he was too focused on Katherine as she sat across from him, talking about her life back in Philadelphia, about her mother's long illness and death, about how strange and wonderful and terrifying she found this wild territory with its endless skies and harsh beauty. "I thought I would hate it here," she admitted as the afternoon light slanted long through the windows. "I thought I would spend every moment wanting to go home, but there is something about this place that gets inside you. The space, the possibility. Like you could reinvent yourself entirely and no one would be the wiser." "Is that what you want?" Marcus asked. "To reinvent yourself?" Katherine considered the question seriously. "I want to be more than my grief. Back home, I was the poor girl whose mother died and everyone looked at me with such pity. Here, I am just Katherine, the girl who helps at the boarding house and makes decent pie. It is freeing in a way I did not expect." "I understand that," Marcus said. "Sometimes you need to be someone new, somewhere new, just to remember who you really are underneath all the things that have happened to you." They talked until the dinner crowd started trickling in, and Katherine had to return to work. Marcus paid his bill, left a generous tip, and stepped out onto the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled the wildflowers in the meadow. He should leave. He should get on his horse and ride north like he had planned. But his feet carried him to the small hotel across the street instead, where he paid for a room for the night, telling himself it was just because it was getting late and he was tired from all the traveling. He did not examine too closely the fact that his window looked directly across at the Copper Bell, or that he found himself watching for glimpses of Katherine moving past the lit windows as evening deepened into night. Over the next week, Marcus discovered that Winslow, Arizona territory, had plenty of work for a man with his skills if he was willing to adapt. The local sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Tom Carson, needed a temporary deputy while his regular man recovered from a broken leg. The job paid decent, and mostly involved breaking up fights at the saloons and making sure the miners did not shoot each other over claim disputes. It was not exciting work, but it was honest, and it gave Marcus a legitimate reason to stay in town without having to admit to himself why he really wanted to stay. He took his meals at the Copper Bell 3 times a day, and each time he found himself lingering a little longer, talking with Katherine when her aunt would allow it, learning the small details of her life that somehow felt more important than anything he had known before. She loved books but rarely had time to read them. She missed the ocean, which she had visited once as a child, and the sound of waves at night. She sang while she baked, old hymns her mother had taught her, and the songs made her both sad and happy at the same time. She was afraid of scorpions but fascinated by the roadrunners that darted across the desert. She wanted to learn to ride a horse properly, not just sit primly on a wagon seat, but her aunt thought it was unladylike. "I could teach you," Marcus offered one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch after the dinner service was finished, "if your aunt would allow it." Katherine's face lit up with such pure joy that Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "Would you really? Oh, that would be wonderful." Aunt Margaret was less enthusiastic about the idea, but Katherine wore her down with a combination of pleading and practical arguments about how useful it would be to know how to handle a horse in emergency situations. Finally, the older woman relented with the condition that all riding lessons take place in broad daylight and within sight of town. "I mean it, Katherine," she said sternly, though her eyes held warmth when they looked at Marcus. "You are in my care, and I will not have your father thinking I let you run wild in the territory." "We will be completely proper," Katherine promised, squeezing her aunt's hand. "I swear it." The next morning, Marcus showed up at the boarding house with a gentle mare he had borrowed from the livery, a sweet-tempered animal named Daisy, who would not spook at anything short of a rattlesnake. Katherine came out wearing a split riding skirt she had sewn herself from an old dress, and the practical outfit somehow made her even more beautiful in Marcus's eyes. They rode out to the same meadow where they had first met, the wildflowers now in their full glory as spring deepened toward summer. Marcus started with the basics, showing Katherine how to hold the reins, how to sit balanced in the saddle, how to use her legs and body weight to communicate with the horse rather than just pulling on the bit. She was a natural student, focused and unafraid, laughing when Daisy decided to stop and crop at the flowers despite Katherine's attempts to urge her forward. "She has got a mind of her own," Katherine said, slightly breathless from the effort of trying to stay in control. "She is a lady," Marcus said from where he sat on his own horse beside her. "And ladies generally do as they please once they have made up their minds. You just have to convince her that what you want is what she wants too." "And how do I do that?" "Gentle persistence. Firm kindness. Same way you would handle any relationship worth having." Katherine glanced at him sharply, and Marcus realized what he had just said, how it could be interpreted. But before he could backtrack or clarify, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made his stomach flip. "Is that how you handle all your relationships, Marcus Lawson? Gentle persistence and firm kindness?" "I would," he said honestly, meeting her eyes, "if I had any relationships worth handling." The moment stretched between them, weighted with everything they had not said, everything that was building like a summer storm on the horizon. Then Daisy shook her head, making her bridle jingle, and the spell broke. They rode for 2 hours, and by the end Katherine could walk, trot, and even manage a controlled canter across the flat stretch of meadow. Her cheeks were flushed with exertion and triumph, her hair coming loose from its pins to curl around her face, and Marcus thought he had never seen anything or anyone so vitally, brilliantly alive. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked as they walked the horses cool on the way back to town. "Same time tomorrow," Marcus agreed. "And every day after if you want, at least until you do not need me to teach you any more." "I might always need you to teach me something," Katherine said softly, and the words hung in the warm air between them like a promise. The lessons continued for 2 weeks, and during that time, the space between Marcus and Katherine seemed to shrink incrementally each day. A hand offered to help her dismount that lingered a moment too long, shoulders brushing as they walked their horses side by side. conversations that stretched into the afternoon until the shadows grew long, and they had to reluctantly return to town. Winslow had started to feel less like a way station and more like a destination. Marcus found himself noticing things he had overlooked before. The way the light changed as it moved across the red rock formations to the east. The sound of piano music drifting from the Silver Dollar Saloon on Saturday nights. The friendly nods of townspeople who were starting to recognize him as more than just a stranger passing through. Sheriff Carson offered to make his deputy position permanent, and Marcus, surprising himself, said he would think about it. He rented a small room in a house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who cooked amazing meals and asked no questions about his past. He bought new clothes to replace his trail-worn gear and got a proper haircut from the barber on Main Street. He was putting down roots without quite meaning to, and the realization should have scared him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, troubled sleep. On a Friday evening in late May, Winslow held its monthly social dance in the church hall, and Marcus worked up the courage to ask Katherine if she would let him escort her. He found her in the Copper Bell kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough, and the domestic scene made his carefully rehearsed words tangle in his throat. "Yes," she said before he could even get the question out. "Whatever you came to ask, the answer is yes." "You do not know what I was going to say," Marcus protested, laughing despite his nerves. "I know it was something you were nervous about, which means it was something important to you, which means it is important to me." She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and stepped closer, tilting her head to look up at him. "So yes, I will go to the dance with you. Yes, I will save all my dances for you. Yes, I would love to." "I could have been asking something entirely different," Marcus said, grinning now, his heart racing in his chest. "Were you?" "No, but I could have been." Katherine reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from his forehead with floury fingers, leaving a white streak across his skin. "Then I am glad you were not, because I have been hoping you would ask me for days now, and if you had waited any longer, I was going to have to ask you, and Aunt Margaret would have had palpitations." He caught her hand before she could pull it away, pressing his lips to her knuckles despite the flour coating them. "Katherine Colter, would you do me the great honor of accompanying me to the church social tomorrow evening?" "I would be delighted, Marcus Lawson," she said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "I truly would." The next evening, Marcus put on his new clothes and slicked down his hair and showed up at the Copper Bell with Wildflowers he had picked himself from the meadow where they had first met. Katherine appeared in a dress of soft blue cotton that made her eyes look like jewels, her hair pinned up but with loose curls framing her face, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. "You look beautiful," he said, offering her the flowers. "You look rather handsome yourself," she replied, accepting the bouquet and breathing in their scent. "Let me put these in water and then we can go. Aunt Margaret is already at the hall helping with the refreshments, so she cannot fuss at us about propriety." "I would never do anything improper with you," Marcus said seriously. "I want you to know that. I respect you too much." Katherine set down the flowers and turned to face him fully, her expression equally serious. "I do know that. It is one of the many things I admire about you. But Marcus, I want you to know something too. I am not made of glass. I will not break if you hold my hand or put your arm around my waist during a dance. I am a grown woman, and I know my own mind, and I am choosing to spend this evening with you because I want to, not because I think it is proper or expected." The directness of her words, the clear intention behind them, made Marcus's heart pound so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "All right then," he managed. "No glass, noted." She laughed, the sound bright and free, and took his arm. "Come on, Cowboy, let us go show Winslow how to dance." The church hall was decorated with paper lanterns and bunting, and the space was already crowded with townspeople dressed in their finest clothes. A small band consisting of a fiddle, a guitar, and an accordion played lively reels and waltzes, and the wooden floor had been polished until it gleamed in the lamplight. Marcus and Katherine joined the dancers, and he discovered that, despite her Eastern upbringing, she could match him step for step through the country dances, laughing when they missed a turn or bumped into another couple. When the band shifted to a waltz, Marcus pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and they moved together as if they had been dancing with each other for years instead of minutes. "Where did you learn to dance?" Katherine asked, slightly breathless. "My mother taught me before she died," Marcus said, the memory bittersweet. "She said a man who could dance would always be welcome anywhere, because women would forgive a lot if you could guide them around a dance floor without stepping on their toes. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. She would have liked you, I think. She always said I should find someone with steel in their spine and kindness in their heart." Katherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." They danced through 3 more songs before taking a break for refreshments, finding a relatively quiet corner where they could catch their breath and drink cold lemonade. Aunt Margaret appeared briefly to check on them, but her stern expression softened when she saw how happy Katherine looked, and she simply squeezed her niece's shoulder before moving on to fuss over other details. "She approves," Katherine whispered to Marcus. "I can tell." "Does that matter to you, her approval?" "Yes," Katherine said honestly. "She is the only family I have out here, and she has been kind to me when she did not have to be. I would not want to disappoint her. But Marcus, even if she did not approve, I would still be here with you. I would still be choosing this." The weight of those words, the commitment implied in them, made Marcus set down his lemonade cup with shaking hands. "Katherine, I need to be honest with you about something." "All right," she said, her face suddenly serious. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words coming out rough and unpolished but absolutely true. "I have been falling since the moment I saw you in that meadow, and I am trying real hard not to rush this, not to push you into anything before you are ready, but I need you to know. I need you to understand what my intentions are." Katherine set down her own cup and took both of his hands in hers. "I am falling in love with you too," she said quietly. "I think I have been since you put that flower in my hair, and I am not afraid of that, Marcus. I am not afraid of you or what we might become together." He leaned forward until their foreheads touched, not caring who might see, not caring about anything except this moment and this woman and the impossible gift of being understood. "I want to court you properly," he whispered. "I want to do this right." "Then court me properly," Katherine whispered back. "Take me on walks and bring me flowers and ask my aunt's permission for things. But Marcus, do not make me wait forever, all right? Life is too short and too uncertain for that." "I will not," he promised. "I swear I will not." They stayed at the dance until late, and Marcus walked Katherine home under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. At the boarding house door, he kissed her hand like a gentleman, but Katherine surprised him by stretching up on her toes and pressing her lips to his cheek, a brief, sweet touch that burned like a brand. "Good night, Marcus Lawson," she said softly. "Thank you for a perfect evening." "Good night, Katherine Colter," he replied, touching the spot where her lips had been. "Thank you for saying yes." He watched until she was safely inside, then walked back to his rented room feeling like he was floating 6 inches off the ground. The future, which had seemed so murky and uncertain just weeks ago, now felt bright and full of possibility. Over the next 2 months, Marcus courted Katherine with a determination and tenderness that became the talk of Winslow. He brought her flowers every day, sometimes wildflowers from the meadow, sometimes more exotic blooms he ordered special from Flagstaff. He took her on walks around town in the cool of the evening, always with a chaperone as propriety demanded, usually Aunt Margaret or one of the other boarding house residents. He showed up at the Copper Bell every morning for breakfast and every evening for dinner, and the regulars started leaving his usual corner table empty, even when the place was crowded. He formally asked Margaret Thornton's permission to court her niece, a conversation that involved sitting in the boarding house parlor while the older woman grilled him about his intentions, his financial situation, his past, and his plans for the future. By the end, Margaret had tears in her eyes, and she gave her blessing with a fierce hug that surprised them both. "You are a good man, Marcus Lawson," she said, pulling back to look him in the eye. "That girl has been through enough pain. You treat her right, you hear me?" "I will," Marcus promised. "I swear on everything I hold sacred, I will." Katherine bloomed under the attention like one of her wildflowers given water and sun. She laughed more, smiled more, moved through her days with a lightness that drew people to her. The boarding house guests adored her, and many of them made a point of telling Marcus he was a lucky man, a fact he was well aware of every single day. In late July, Winslow held its annual Independence Day celebration, a full day of events including horse races, shooting contests, pie-eating competitions, and culminating in a fireworks display after dark. Marcus entered the shooting contest because the prize money was substantial, and he wanted to be able to offer Katherine something more than just his heart and good intentions. Katherine came to watch, standing at the edge of the crowd with her aunt, and her presence made Marcus's hands steadier than they had been in years. He won the contest handily, and when he collected his prize, he walked straight to Katherine and presented her with the ribbon, ignoring the cheers and catcalls from the other competitors. "I want you to have this," he said, "as a symbol of everything I am working toward. The kind of future where I can give you nice things and a good home and all the security you deserve." Katherine took the ribbon, but her eyes were serious. "Marcus, I do not need nice things or security. I mean, those things are wonderful, but they are not why I love you. I love you because you are kind and honest, and you see me as I really am, not as some fragile thing to be protected, but as a partner, an equal. That is worth more than all the prize money in the territory." "I know," Marcus said, pulling her into his arms despite the public setting, despite her aunt standing right there watching. "But I still want to give you everything. I still want to build something with you, something that will last." "Then let us build it together," Katherine said, her arms going around his waist. "Not you providing for me, but us creating something neither of us could make alone." That night, as they watched the fireworks explode over the desert in showers of colored light, Marcus made a decision. He had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But he realized there would never be a moment more perfect than this one, with Katherine's hand in his and the whole town celebrating around them. He dropped to one knee right there in the dusty street, and the people nearby noticed and started to hush, the silence spreading outward like ripples in water, until even the children stopped their running around to watch. "Katherine Colter," Marcus said, his voice carrying clear in the sudden quiet. "I know we have not known each other long by most people's standards, just a few months, but I have learned more about myself in these months with you than I learned in all the years before. You have shown me what it means to be brave without violence, to be strong without hardness, to hope without being foolish. You have made me want to be better, to build instead of just survive. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become." Will you marry me?" He pulled out the ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, and held it up in the flickering light of the fireworks still bursting overhead. Catherine's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, brilliantly, joyfully smiling. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as almost a sob. "Yes, Marcus, of course I will marry you." The crowd erupted in cheers as Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to pull her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time. A kiss that tasted of salt tears and sweet lemonade and the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. Aunt Margaret was crying openly, and when they finally broke apart, she wrapped them both in a fierce embrace. "You have my blessing," she said, her voice thick. "You have all my blessings. Oh, your mother would be so happy, Katherine, so very happy." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and celebrations, townspeople coming up to shake Marcus's hand or kiss Catherine's cheek, offers of help with the wedding, gifts pressed into their hands. By the time they finally returned to the Copper Bell, it was past midnight, and Katherine was drooping with exhaustion but still glowing with happiness. "Come sit with me for a minute," Marcus said, guiding her to the porch swing. "Before you go in, I want to talk about the future, make some plans." Katherine settled beside him, her head coming to rest naturally on his shoulder. "What kind of plans?" "Practical ones, unfortunately. Like where we will live and how soon we should get married and what I should do for work long term." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Sheriff Carson has offered me the deputy position permanently, and it pays enough that we could rent a small house, maybe even start saving to buy some land eventually. But Katherine, I need to know if you are comfortable with me being in law enforcement. It can be dangerous, and after what happened in Tombstone, I would understand if you would rather I found something else." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, her hand finding his and threading their fingers together. "I will not lie and say the danger does not scare me," she said finally. "But Marcus, you are meant for this work. I have seen how people in town look at you, how much safer they feel knowing you are watching out for them. You are not protecting rich men's selfish interests anymore. You are protecting families, children, people who cannot always protect themselves. That matters. That means something. It could mean me not coming home some night," Marcus said bluntly. "I need you to understand that possibility." "I understand it. And I choose you anyway, choose us anyway, because the alternative is living in fear, never taking the risk, never knowing what we could have built together." She lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes fierce in the dim light. "I lost my mother, Marcus. I know how precious and fragile life is. I am not going to waste the time we have together worrying about all the things that might go wrong. I am going to focus on making every day count." He kissed her then, slow and deep, pouring all his love and gratitude and wonder into the connection. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured against her lips. "What did I do to deserve you? You picked a flower and put it in my hair," Katherine said, smiling. "You saw me and you chose kindness. Everything else grew from that." They set the wedding date for September, giving them 2 months to prepare. It would be a simple ceremony in the church with a reception at the Copper Bell, nothing fancy but everything they needed. Katherine wrote to her father in Philadelphia, telling him about Marcus and the engagement, asking for his blessing though she had already made her choice regardless of his answer. The letter that came back 3 weeks later was warmer than Katherine had dared hope. Her father wrote that, while he was surprised by how quickly things had progressed, he trusted her judgment and was glad she had found happiness again after so much sadness. He sent money for her wedding dress and a substantial check made out to Marcus, with a note saying it was a dowry and an investment in their future together. Marcus stared at the check with something close to shock. "This is more money than I have ever had at one time," he said. "We could buy a house outright with this, or a piece of land, or start a business." "We will do whatever makes the most sense," Katherine said practically. "Let us talk to the banker and see what our options are." They ended up buying a small house on the edge of town. A 2-bedroom adobe with a kitchen, a parlor, and a porch that looked out toward the mountains. It needed work, but it had good bones, and Marcus threw himself into the repairs with an enthusiasm that would have surprised his younger self, the one who never stayed anywhere long enough to care about fixing things up. Katherine helped when she could, learning to paint and hammer nails and mix plaster under Marcus's patient instruction. They worked side by side in the cool evenings, and sometimes they would stop and just stand together, looking at what they were building, this life they were creating from nothing but love and determination. The wedding took place on a clear September morning, the heat of summer finally breaking into the cooler promise of fall. Katherine wore a dress of ivory silk that her aunt had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had been her mother's, something old to carry forward into this new life. The desert marigold Marcus had given her that first day was pressed and preserved in a locket she wore around her neck, something borrowed from the universe that she was making her own. Marcus stood at the altar in his best suit, his hair slicked back and his hands shaking slightly as Katherine walked down the aisle toward him, radiant and beautiful and choosing him, still choosing him even after seeing all his flaws and fears. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken in clear voices that carried to every corner of the small church. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Marcus kissed his bride with such tender reverence that several people in the audience started crying again, overcome by the obvious love between them. The reception at the Copper Bell lasted well into the evening, with more food than 50 people could possibly eat and dancing that went on until the stars came out. Marcus and Katherine cut their wedding cake, a towering creation that Katherine had spent 3 days making, and fed each other bites while their guests cheered. They danced their first dance as husband and wife to a waltz played by the same band from the church social, and Marcus held Katherine close, breathing in the scent of her hair and trying to memorize every detail of this moment, this perfect, impossible moment that he would have said was beyond him just a few short months ago. "Happy," he whispered against her ear. Deliriously, Katherine whispered back. "You, more than I knew it was possible to be." They left the reception around 10 in the evening, walking hand in hand to their new home while the celebration continued behind them. The house was small and simple, but Katherine had filled it with flowers and the furniture they had collected piece by piece, and in the lamplight it glowed with warmth and welcome. Marcus carried her over the threshold as tradition demanded, and Katherine laughed, her arms around his neck, her face flushed with joy and champagne and the promise of the night ahead. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," Marcus said, setting her gently on her feet but not letting go. "Welcome home, Mr. Lawson," Katherine replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Now and always." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and everything two people discovering each other should be. And when Marcus woke in the early hours of the morning with Katherine curled against his side, her hair spread across his chest like silk, he felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening in its intensity. He had spent so many years moving, running, never letting himself want anything permanent because permanent meant vulnerable, meant having something to lose. But lying there in the darkness with his wife breathing softly beside him, Marcus realized that vulnerability was not weakness. It was strength. It took more courage to stay and build and love than it ever took to leave. Their first year of marriage brought challenges they had not anticipated. Marcus's work as deputy was often demanding, with long hours and occasional danger when miners got drunk and violent, or when claim disputes turned into shooting matches. Katherine hated the nights when he came home with bruises or worse, when she had to patch him up and try not to think about how much worse it could have been. But there were also moments of profound joy. Katherine turned their small house into a real home, with curtains she sewed herself, and a garden she coaxed from the stubborn desert soil. She continued to help her aunt at the Copper Bell, but also started taking in sewing work, her skilled fingers turning out dresses and shirts that were soon in high demand among the wealthier families in town. Marcus was promoted to full sheriff when Tom Carson retired, a position that came with more money and more responsibility. He hired 2 new deputies and set about making Winslow as safe and peaceful as a frontier town could be, breaking up the criminal elements that had been operating with impunity and establishing a reputation for firm but fair justice. They spent their evenings together when Marcus's work allowed, sitting on their porch and talking about their days, making plans for the future. They wanted children eventually, but agreed to wait a year or two to give themselves time to be just the 2 of them, to build their foundation solid before adding more to it. But life had other plans. In the spring of their 2nd year together, Katherine realized she had missed her monthly courses and felt a familiar nausea that the older women at church had warned her about. She waited another week to be sure, then told Marcus one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I am pregnant," she said simply, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." Marcus stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, wonder, and finally pure joy so intense it took Katherine's breath away. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor, which I will do tomorrow. But yes, I am sure. We are going to be parents, Marcus." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness on her neck and realized he was crying, great silent sobs that shook his entire body. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Katherine asked, though she could already see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Marcus said, pulling back to look at her with eyes still streaming tears. Terrified, amazed, grateful, overwhelmed, but yes, happy. So incredibly happy. The pregnancy was not easy. Katherine suffered from terrible morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, and the Arizona heat that summer was brutal, making her swell and ache. Marcus hovered anxiously, trying to help but often just getting in the way, until Katherine finally had to gently but firmly tell him that she was pregnant, not dying, and he needed to let her do things for herself. But when November came and Katherine went into labor, all her fierce independence disappeared in the face of pain and fear. Marcus held her hand through the entire ordeal, ignoring the midwife's suggestions that he wait outside like most husbands did. He stayed by Katherine's side for 14 hours while she labored, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement, being her anchor in the storm. When their son finally arrived just before dawn, slippery and squalling and absolutely perfect, Marcus caught him in his own hands, tears streaming down his face as he placed the baby on Katherine's chest. "We have a son," Katherine said wonderingly, exhausted and exhilarated all at once. "Marcus, we have a beautiful son." "He is perfect," Marcus agreed, his voice breaking. "You are perfect. This is perfect." They named him Matthew Samuel Lawson, Matthew after Marcus's father and Samuel after Katherine's grandfather. He had a shock of dark hair like his father and his mother's green eyes. and from the first moment, he owned both their hearts completely. Marcus threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything he cared about. He learned to change diapers and warm bottles of expressed milk, to walk the floor at 3 in the morning when Matthew was fussy, to sing lullabies in his rough, untrained voice that somehow always soothed the baby when nothing else would. Katherine watched her husband transform into a father and fell in love with him all over again, seeing this tender, patient side of him that she had known existed but never seen expressed so fully. Their life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before, but also richer, fuller. Matthew grew from a helpless infant into a curious toddler who explored every inch of their small house and yard with determined concentration. Marcus taught him to ride on a gentle pony when he was just 3, and Katherine taught him his letters and numbers, reading to him every night from the small library they had accumulated. When Matthew was 4, Katherine found herself pregnant again, and this time she knew what to expect, knew how to manage the sickness and the discomfort. Their daughter Sarah Grace arrived in early spring, much faster than Matthew had, a pink and perfect little creature who looked like a miniature version of Katherine. Marcus held her with awestruck wonder, this tiny girl who would wrap him around her finger from day one. "She looks like you," he told Katherine, his voice thick with emotion. "She is beautiful." "She looks like us," Katherine corrected, tracing the baby's nose the shape of her ears. "She is the best of both of us." With 2 children, their house felt small, so they added on 2 more rooms, building them themselves with the help of friends from town. The sheriff's salary was good now, and Katherine's sewing business brought in steady income, so they could afford the lumber and supplies without hardship. They worked on the addition in the evenings and on Marcus's days off, and Matthew helped in his own 4-year-old way, carrying nails and holding boards while his father hammered. It was slow work, but satisfying, watching their home grow to accommodate their growing family. The years passed in a blur of school programs and birthday parties, of Matthew learning to read, and then devouring every book he could get his hands on, of Sarah starting to walk and talk and assert her strong will at every opportunity. Marcus continued as sheriff, respected and liked by most of the town, and Katherine balanced motherhood with her sewing and occasional help at the Copper Bell, which Aunt Margaret still ran with cheerful efficiency well into her 60s. When Matthew was 8 and Sarah was 4, Katherine found herself pregnant once more, unexpected this time but no less welcomed. Their 3rd child, a boy they named Luke Thomas, arrived in December, a Christmas baby who seemed to bring light into the darkest time of year. "3 children," Marcus said wonderingly, holding Luke while Matthew and Sarah crowded close to meet their new brother. "We have 3 children. How did that happen?" "I believe I know how it happened," Katherine said dryly, making Marcus laugh and blush. Their house was loud and chaotic and full of love. Matthew helped with his younger siblings when he was old enough, showing Sarah how to spell words and teaching Luke to throw a ball. Sarah was the wild one, always climbing trees and catching lizards despite Katherine's attempts to encourage more ladylike behavior. Luke was quieter, thoughtful, content to sit and watch his siblings play while he worked out the patterns of the world around him. Marcus looked at his family sometimes and felt overwhelmed by how much he had been given, how drastically his life had changed from that day he rode into Winslow broken and lost. He tried to imagine what his younger self would think of him now, settled and domestic, spending his evenings reading bedtime stories instead of sitting in saloons, worrying about school fees and shoe sizes instead of which town to drift to next. He could not imagine being anywhere else, being anyone else. Katherine felt the same wonder, though hers was tinged with sadness sometimes when she thought of her mother and how much she would have loved her grandchildren. But Aunt Margaret stepped into that role with enthusiasm, spoiling the children with cookies and stories and unconditional love. When Matthew turned 10, he asked his father to teach him to shoot, and Marcus agreed, but with strict conditions. "A gun is a tool," he told his son seriously as they stood in the desert with targets set up against a sand bank. "It is not a toy, and it is not something to use to prove how tough you are. You only draw a weapon if you are prepared to use it to protect yourself or someone else. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Matthew said solemnly. And over the following months, Marcus taught him everything he knew about firearm safety, about accuracy and responsibility and the weight of taking another life, even in self-defense. He hoped Matthew would never need to use those skills, but he also knew that hoping was not enough. This was still a rough territory, still a place where danger could find you despite your best efforts to avoid it. Better his son be prepared and never need it than the reverse. Sarah demanded to learn too, insisting it was not fair that only Matthew got to do the interesting things, and after some discussion with Katherine, Marcus agreed. Sarah turned out to be a natural shot, with steady hands and sharp eyes that rarely missed, and Marcus felt a mixture of pride and worry watching his fierce daughter master a skill he wished she would never need. Luke was still too young, but he watched his siblings' lessons with intense focus, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before he would be asking for his own turn. The children grew, and the town grew around them. Winslow transformed from a rough mining settlement into a proper community with a schoolhouse, a church, a library, and several thriving businesses. The railroad came through in 1881, bringing more people and more prosperity, and Marcus found himself dealing with different kinds of problems than he had in the early days, more thefts and confidence schemes than shootouts and claim disputes. He adapted, learning to navigate the changing landscape of law enforcement, and his reputation spread beyond Winslow. He was offered positions in larger towns with better pay and more prestige, but he always turned them down. Winslow was home. Katherine and the children were here, their friends, their life. He had no desire to start over somewhere else, to chase after something bigger when what he had was already more than he had ever dreamed. Katherine's father visited from Philadelphia when Matthew was 12, Sarah was 8, and Luke was 4. It was the first time he had made the journey west, and Katherine was nervous about how it would go, whether her father would approve of the life she had built so far from the world she had grown up in. But Jonathan Colter took one look at his daughter's home, at her healthy, happy children, at the way Marcus looked at her like she hung the moon, and any reservations he might have had melted away. "You have done well for yourself, Katherine," he said on his last evening there, sitting on the porch while the children played in the yard under the setting sun. "I will admit I had doubts when you first wrote to me about Marcus. It seemed so fast, so impulsive. But I see now that you knew what you were doing. You found a good man in a hard land, and you built something real together." "We did," Katherine agreed, watching Marcus teach Luke how to throw a rope, the little boy's face screwed up in concentration. "I miss Mama every day, Papa." "I wish she could have met Marcus, seen all of this, but I think she would be happy for me." "She would be," Jonathan said, his voice thick. "She would be so proud of the woman you have become, the mother you are. I am proud too, sweetheart, more than I can say." They held each other while the desert sunset painted the sky, and Katherine felt a sense of completion, of her two worlds finally meeting and accepting each other. The years continued their steady march. Matthew grew into a tall, serious young man who wanted to study law, much to Marcus's pride. Sarah remained a force of nature, beautiful and wild and completely uninterested in the domestic arts her mother tried to teach her, preferring to spend her time riding or helping her father at the sheriff's office. Luke was the scholar, always reading, always asking questions about how things worked and why. Marcus and Katherine watched their children become their own people and marveled at how quickly the years had passed. It seemed like just yesterday Katherine was collecting wildflowers in a meadow, and a broken cowboy had stopped to put one in her hair. When Matthew was 18 and preparing to leave for law school in California, the family gathered for a farewell dinner at the house that had been added onto so many times it barely resembled the original small adobe structure. Matthew made a speech, thanking his parents for everything they had given him, for the opportunities they had worked so hard to provide. "I know I have not always been the easiest son," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I want you both to know that everything good in me comes from watching you two. The way you love each other, the way you support each other, the way you never gave up even when things were hard. That is what I want to find someday, what you have. That is what I will spend my life looking for." Katherine was crying openly, and even Marcus had to wipe at his eyes. Sarah hugged her brother fiercely, making him promise to write every week, and Luke clung to him like he might never let go. After Matthew left, the house felt emptier, but life went on. Sarah started helping more at the sheriff's office, proving to have a natural aptitude for investigation and a fearlessness that served her well. She announced at 16 that she had no intention of marrying, that she wanted to be a deputy like her father, and after some discussion, Marcus agreed to train her properly. Luke discovered a passion for medicine after helping the town doctor set a broken arm, and he began apprenticing when he was 14, learning the trade with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. Marcus and Katherine found themselves slowly becoming the older generation, the ones people came to for advice and guidance. Sheriff Lawson was an institution in Winslow, and Mrs. Lawson was known throughout the territory for her fine sewing and her kind heart. They attended weddings and christenings, sat with the sick and grieving, helped settle disputes and mediate conflicts. Aunt Margaret passed peacefully in her sleep when she was 78, and Katherine grieved deeply for the woman who had been her anchor when she first came west. They buried her in the Winslow cemetery overlooking the mountains, and half the town turned out for the service, testament to how many lives she had touched. The copper bell was sold to a young couple from St. Louis, but Katherine made them promise to keep fresh flowers on the dining tables, a tradition her aunt had started and she wanted preserved. When Marcus turned 50, the town threw him a surprise party at the church hall, the same place where he and Katherine had danced at that first social so many years ago. Looking around at the crowd of friends and neighbors, at his grown children and his wife still beautiful despite the silver threads in her hair, Marcus felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He made a speech that was rambling and emotional, thanking the town for accepting him when he was just a broken drifter, for giving him a chance to prove himself, for becoming his home in every sense of the word. He talked about Katherine and how she had saved him without even knowing he needed saving, how she had shown him that it was possible to build something lasting and good even in a place as hard as the Arizona territory. "I rode into Winslow 26 years ago with nothing but a horse and a lot of regrets," he said, his voice carrying clear in the hushed hall. "I had given up on finding anything worth staying for. And then I saw a woman collecting wildflowers, and I picked one and put it in her hair, and everything changed. Everything. That one small moment of gentleness in a life that had been mostly hard, that was all it took to start me on a different path. So I guess what I am saying is, Pay attention to the small moments. Pay attention to the wildflowers and the simple kindness. You never know when one of those moments might change everything. The applause was thunderous, and Katherine came to stand beside him, taking his hand like she had 1,000 times before, and they faced their community together, partners still, lovers still, after all these years. Matthew came home from law school with a degree and a wife, a smart young woman named Elizabeth who fit into the family like she had always belonged. They settled in Flagstaff, where Matthew opened his practice, but they visited often, and Katherine delighted in finally having a daughter who wanted to learn her sewing techniques and baking secrets. Sarah did become a deputy, the first female deputy in Arizona Territory, and she handled the role with such competence that soon other towns were hiring women too, using her as an example of what was possible. She never did marry, content with her work and her independence, though she had suitors aplenty over the years. Luke became a doctor, opening a practice in Winslow and becoming the most trusted medical man in 3 counties. He married at 25, a quiet woman named Grace who was a teacher at the schoolhouse, and they had 4 children in quick succession, keeping Katherine busy with babysitting and making clothes for an ever-expanding brood of grandchildren. Marcus retired from being sheriff when he turned 55, his body finally forcing him to admit that he could not keep up with younger criminals anymore. But he stayed on as a consultant, and the new sheriff, one of the deputies Marcus had trained years ago, came to him regularly for advice and guidance. Retirement suited him better than he expected. He spent his days working in the garden Katherine had expanded over the years, reading the books he had never had time for, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with his wife watching the sunsets they never tired of. "You ever regret it?" Katherine asked him one evening as they sat in their usual spots, his hand holding hers like always. "Staying here, settling down, giving up the wandering life." Marcus turned to look at her, this woman who had been his wife for over 30 years, who had given him children and grandchildren, who had built a life with him from nothing but love and determination. "Not for a single second," he said honestly. "You are my adventure, Katherine. You always have been. Everything else is just details." She smiled, that same brilliant smile that had captivated him the first time he saw it, and leaned over to kiss him softly. "You are my adventure too," she whispered. "My wild, wonderful adventure that started with a flower in my hair." They grew old together in Winslow, watching the town transform from rough frontier settlement to proper city, with paved streets and electric lights. They saw Arizona become a state in 1912, and Marcus joked that he had been here long enough to remember when it was just the wild territory, lawless and rough. Their children thrived and gave them more grandchildren, and then those grandchildren grew up and started families of their own, creating a sprawling clan of Lawsons spread across the Southwest. Family gatherings were loud, chaotic affairs that filled their expanded house to bursting, and Marcus and Katherine presided over them like the patriarch and matriarch they had become. Marcus's health began to fail when he was in his early 70s, his heart giving out after a lifetime of hard use. The doctor, their own son Luke, told him gently that he needed to take it easy, that his time was growing shorter. Marcus accepted the news with equanimity, feeling like he had already been given far more years than he deserved. "I am not afraid," he told Katherine one night as they lay in bed, her head on his shoulder like she had slept for decades. "I've had a good life, more than good. The best life any man could ask for." "Do not talk like that," Katherine said fiercely, though her voice shook. "You are not going anywhere yet. We have more time. We have to have more time." "We have had 50 years," Marcus said gently, stroking her hair. 50 incredible years that I never thought I would get. That is more than enough, my love. That is more than I dreamed." But he held on for another 3 years, determined to see his grandchildren graduate and marry, to meet the newest great-grandchildren, to have as much time with Katherine as the universe would allow. They took walks when he was strong enough, slow circuits around their property, stopping to admire the flowers Katherine still planted every spring, descendants of those wildflowers from the meadow where they had met. On a warm September evening, as the sun painted the sky in those familiar shades of gold and crimson, Marcus sat on the porch with Katherine beside him, surrounded by several generations of family. He felt tired, bone-deep tired in a way that told him his time was finally running out. But he was not afraid. He looked around at the faces of his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, all of them here because of that one moment 50 years ago when he had seen a woman collecting flowers and chosen kindness over continuing to run. "I want you all to know," he said, his voice weak but clear, "that I have been blessed beyond measure. I came to this territory broken and lost, and I found everything I needed right here. I found love and purpose and family. I found home. And it all started because your grandmother was collecting wildflowers and I picked one and put it in her hair." Katherine was crying, holding his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. "Marcus," she whispered, "please." "It is all right, sweetheart," he said softly, just for her. "You gave me the best 50 years any man could have. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. I love you. I will always love you." He closed his eyes as the sun dipped below the horizon, Katherine's hand in his, surrounded by the family they had built together, and he slipped away peacefully, ready for whatever came next, knowing he had lived a life worth living. Katherine grieved deeply for her husband, but she did not fall apart. She had their children and grandchildren around her, helping her through the dark days, reminding her that Marcus's legacy lived on in all of them. She continued living in the house they had built together, tending the gardens, welcoming the family gatherings, keeping Marcus's memory alive through stories and love. She lived another 10 years, long enough to see Matthew become a judge, Sarah train the next generation of female deputies, Luke publish a medical textbook that was used across the country. She lived to hold great-great-grandchildren and to see the family spread even farther, to Texas and California and Oregon, all of them carrying forward the values Marcus and Katherine had instilled. When her own time came, Katherine was ready. She passed quietly in her sleep at 87, and they buried her beside Marcus in the Winslow cemetery, their headstones side by side, facing the mountains they had loved. The funeral was enormous, with over 200 people in attendance, testament to the lives they had lived and the impact they had made. Matthew gave the eulogy, talking about his parents' love story, about how they had found each other when both were at their lowest points and built something beautiful together. "My father used to say that one moment of kindness changed his entire life," Matthew said, his voice carrying clear in the desert air. One simple gesture, picking a wildflower and putting it in a woman's hair. But it was not just the gesture. It was what came after. The choosing each other every day, the building together, the refusing to give up when things were hard. That was their real legacy, not the single moment but the 50 years of moments that followed. On their shared headstone, the family had inscribed a simple epitaph. He found her collecting wildflowers. They found each other collecting a life. And every spring, wildflowers bloomed around their graves, descendants of the seeds Katherine had planted over the years, bright splashes of orange and purple and gold that would continue to bloom long after everyone who knew them personally was gone. A living monument to a love that had started with one simple act of gentleness in a hard world and grown into something that touched hundreds of lives across generations. The house where Marcus and Katherine had raised their family became a gathering place for the family, passed down through the generations, added onto and modernized, but never losing its essential character. In the front room, in a place of honor, hung a pressed flower in a frame, the desert marigold Marcus had picked that first day, preserved all these years as a reminder of where everything started. And on warm spring mornings, when the light hit the mountains just right and the wildflowers bloomed in the meadows around Winslow, descendants of Marcus and Katherine would sometimes walk out to that original meadow, the one where their story began, and they would pick flowers and put them in each other's hair, continuing a tradition of gentleness and love that had started over a century ago and showed no signs of ending. The story of Marcus Lawson and Katherine Colter became part of Winslow's history, told to schoolchildren and visitors, a reminder that even in the hardest times and the roughest places, love could flourish if you were brave enough to choose it, if you were willing to stop running and start building, if you could see the beauty in someone else and have the courage to reach out. It was a story about second chances and new beginnings, about the transformative power of small kindnesses, about how one moment could change everything if you let it. It was a love story for the ages, born in the dust and heat of the Arizona territory, growing and flourishing through decades of joy and hardship, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through generations. And it all started with a cowboy and a woman and a wildflower, and the courage to choose hope over despair, love over loneliness, together over alone. That choice made all the difference, and the ripples of it spread outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, touching lives in ways Marcus and Katherine could never have imagined that first morning when their eyes met across a meadow of blooms. Their love story became legend, the kind that inspired others to take chances on their own happiness, to believe that it was never too late to change course, to find someone who saw you for who you really were and loved you anyway. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, real and true and tested by time, proving that some things once found could never truly be lost, that some bonds once forged could never truly be broken. And every spring, without fail, the wildflowers bloomed,